Hey guys, welcome back to Based MMA. In this video, I'm going to be ranking every fight on UFC 300 from worst to best. We're going to be going over the card and seeing which fights are good fights, which fights are good fights but maybe not appropriate for the card, and which fights are just absolutely terrible that absolutely make no sense why they made them. And before I get started with this list, please make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. It will really help my channel out. So let's start off with this video. The worst fight on UFC 300, in my opinion, has to be Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage. And it's not only because of where the fight is on the card, because the fight is on the main card. It's not only because of that. Like, I would really have no problem with Bo Nickal being on the main card if he was fighting a better opponent. So the root problem with this fight is Cody Brundage, and it's not going to be a competitive fight. I mean, it's MMA. I know anything could really happen, but if we're being honest, I mean, Bo Nickal's a minus 1,650 favorite. So that should tell you everything about this fight. It's not a very competitive fight. And at this point, look, I know Bo Nickal only has like 4 or 5 fights in MMA, but I was expecting, a step up in competition at least, man, especially if you're trying to put him on the main card. And the fact that he's fighting Cody Brundage and he hasn't fought since UFC 290, I mean, I'm not too sure why he has taken so long to return to the octagon. And then you put him against Cody Brundage and then you're trying to push him to the main card. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So for that reason, I think Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage, because the fight is not competitive, is probably the worst fight on UFC 300. Now, the second worst fight on the card for me has to be Holly Holm versus Kayla Harrison. And the reason why is because Holly Holm, she's older now. She's not in the prime of her career anymore. And Kayla Harrison, I know she's making her UFC debut, but I'm not that excited. All she's going to do is go and grapple and take down Holly Holm and pretty much dominate and probably win a decision. But I mean, I don't really expect a banger. I'm pretty sure you guys are not that excited for this fight either. It's just a fight that the UFC can advertise as, look, Holly Holm, former champion, Kayla Harrison. Oh, we're all excited. But the reality is that we're not really that excited. Nothing against these girls, but I'm not that excited for their fight. Now, the next fight is Jessica Andrade versus Marina Rodriguez. And I think this is actually going to be a fun scrap. It's going to be a fun scrap, but this is not a fight that I would have put on UFC 300. I feel like it doesn't really make sense for this fight to be on UFC 300. If anything, it probably made more sense to put this fight at UFC 301 since that card is taking place in Brazil and you have 2 Brazilians. So it's kind of a weird fight to put on UFC 300. I mean, Jessica Andrade, I know she's coming off that win over Mackenzie Dern, but prior to that, I mean, she was like in a 3-4 fight losing streak. So it's kind of a weird matchup. Like, it's a fine fight. You know what I'm saying? Like, it should be fun. It's going to be a good prelim per se, but it's not a fight that, you're thinking about when it comes to UFC 300. So for that reason, I think it's the third worst fight on the card. And maybe you guys are going to be surprised that this is over Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage, but the reason why I hate that fight is because it's not going to be competitive. You know what I'm saying? And we want to see competitive matchups in the UFC. Now, the next fight is Bobby Green versus Jim Miller. And I actually love this fight for UFC 300 because Jim Miller, I mean, he's fought at UFC 100. He's fought at UFC 200. And the fact that he's still doing this at this point in his career and he's still getting W's and submissions and stuff like that is pretty impressive. And the fact also that Bobby Green is coming off a knockout loss to Jalen Turner, which was one of the worst stoppages I've ever seen, I think makes this fight a little bit more interesting because I feel like a couple of years ago, maybe some of you guys were going to be picking Bobby Green to win this fight pretty easily when it comes to the striking. But now, under these circumstances, I could see a lot of people picking Jim Miller, even though he's still a pretty good underdog. Like, I think this could be a competitive fight, and I think this is a perfect fight to have on the prelims of UFC 300. So I really have no problems with this fight. The reason why it's so low in the list is because it's not a fight that I'm like, I can't wait to see. You know what I'm saying? It's not a fight that I'm dying to see. So for that reason, I have it here on the list. But like I said, I really have no problem with this fight. Now, the next fight would be Renato Moicano versus Jalen Turner. And this is actually the fight that most recently got added to the card. And it's kind of a weird one too. Look, I think Moicano has a good personality. Jalen Turner is coming off that knockout over Bobby Green. But I just feel like it's one of those fights too that feels very random. Like, it just feels very random. And like I feel like this fight also, like the Jessica Andrade versus Marina Rodriguez, is just a fight that probably better belongs at UFC 301 because you have Moicano, Brazilian. I think UFC 301 needs a lot of help, and I felt like they put a lot of fights on 300 that just did not make a lot of sense. Like, I mean, what was the point of adding Renato Moicano versus Jalen Turner to 300? Like, nobody's gonna be like, oh wow, I hated the card, but now they added Moicano and Turner, now I love the card. You know what I'm saying? Nobody's gonna switch up. It's just like, oh yeah, just a nice addition. But I would have much preferred if they added Moicano versus Turner to UFC 301 rather than 300. It's just a very random fight, in my opinion. In my opinion, if they were gonna add another fight to 300, add Cyril Gane versus Sergey Pavlovich, like that could have been a good fight to this card that would really bump up the card, in my opinion. But Moicano versus Turner, I mean, it's a good fight in the lightweight division. It's just not a fight that I would have added to UFC 300. It's fine. I really have no problem with it. It should be an entertaining scrap. Moicano's probably going to look to take him down. Turner's going to look to knock him out. It's still going to be a fun fight, just not a fight that I'm like dying to see. Now, the next fight will be Sodiq Yusuff versus Diego Lopez. I think this is going to be an awesome fight. And the reason why I'm excited for this fight is because it's going to be Diego Lopez's first test in the featherweight division to see if he could like climb the rankings in the featherweight division. Because Sodiq Yusuff, I believe he's ranked like 11 or 12. So this is going to be a good test to test Diego Lopez's skills, his striking, his grappling. And Sodiq Yusuff is pretty well-rounded, focuses more on the striking. Diego Lopez is kind of like that Charles Oliveira of 145 pounds. So I'm very excited to see Diego Lopez. I'm glad he's on this card. And it should be a fun fight. Not a fight that people are going to be dying to see. It's not going to be a fight that casuals are dying to see, but I think it's a very, very good fight on UFC 300. Now, the next fight is going to be Deiveson Figueiredo versus Cody Garbrandt. The reason why this fight is not higher on the list is because on paper, this fight should not be that competitive because Cody Garbrandt doesn't have the best chin. Deiveson Figueiredo has a lot of power. So on paper, it's not a good fight. It's not a good fight. I mean, I know it's two recognizable names, two former champions, but on paper, it's not a good fight. You know what I'm saying? But it is MMA. Maybe Cody Garbrandt is able to get something done with his boxing, but Deiveson Figueiredo has a lot of power. He's going to be more durable, as we saw in his fight against Rob Font, that power still translates to the bantamweight division. So, I mean, it should be a good fight, and it's two recognizable names, but it's not a fight that stylistically, to me, is very interesting. You know what I'm saying? It's not a fight that's very interesting. So for that reason, it's not a fight that I'm very excited for, but I still think because it's Cody Garbrandt, because it's Figueiredo, I'm more excited for this fight than some of the other fights. But the next fight would be Yang Weili versus Yang Yaonan. I have no problem with this fight. The only problem with this fight is that it's on 300. It feels a little out of place when you look at the card. And it's a good fight. I mean, Yang Weili is a pretty exciting female fighter. Yang Yaonan has looked pretty good in the striking. But, you know, it's a good bathroom break between Charles Oliveira and Justin Gaethje. And I have nothing against Yang Weili, but let's be honest, like that's not a fight we would have added to 300. And that's a problem with 300 ultimately, is that there's a lot of fights on here where the fight itself, there's nothing wrong with the fight. It just doesn't belong on this card. And Yang Weili versus Yang Yaonan is one of those fights. And it's kind of pathetic how the UFC actually tried to hype up this fight like it was a massive fight. Like, no, it's just another fight in the strawweight division. And if you were going to hype up the angle of like, oh, two Chinese fighters fighting for a championship, then make that fight in China. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're going to try to hype it up through that angle, like, why would you put that on 300? Like, to me, that doesn't make any sense. But I like watching Yang Weili. Should be a fun fight. It is a title fight, so not as hype as I am for other fights, but I still think it's a good fight. It's a good fight. The next fight would be Yuri Prochazka versus Alexander Rakic. Yuri Prochazka is always in a fun fight. I mean, Yuri has only had like 3-4 fights in the UFC, and he's put pretty good fights. I mean, his fight with Alex Pereira was pretty fun. His fight with Glover Teixeira was one of the best fights of all time. You know, he has pretty good performances. I'm excited to see Yuri Prochazka back in the cage. But the only thing that's holding this fight back from being like a top fight at UFC 300 is Alexander Rakic. Because Alexander Rakic is coming off an injury. He's going to look here to grapple. He's not a very exciting fighter. But the fact that he's fighting Yuri Prochazka, I think this fight is going to be a lot more entertaining than we're expecting. I think this fight is actually going to be pretty fun. I think Alexander Rakic is going to look to leg kick, grapple. And I want to see if Yuri Prochazka is able to make some adjustments in his game, because I was so frustrated watching him fight Alex Pereira and not check any leg kicks, not have good defense. It's just very weird. Like, I know he has a very unorthodox style, which helps him like catch opponents and stuff like that. But I feel like he needs to work on his defense if he wants to go far in the light heavyweight division, because if you're already getting dropped 3 fights in the light heavyweight division at 205, then I feel like he could go down a downward trajectory. But this fight is interesting because Alexander Rakic hasn't fought in 2 years. Yuri Prohaska is coming off a knockout loss. So because of those things, I'm actually pretty interested in this fight. But it's not a fight where I'm like thinking about, when it comes to UFC 300. Now the next fight on the card is Calvin Kattar versus Aljamain Sterling. I absolutely love this fight. I love this fight because Aljamain Sterling is making his UFC debut at featherweight. I want to see how he does, and he's fighting Calvin Kattar, primarily a striker, primarily like a boxer, and I want to see how he matches up. Like, is Aljo going to be able to take him down? Is Calvin Kattar going to be able to outstrike him and maybe knock him out? So I think the fact that this is kind of one of those matchups that you don't really expect, like we needed more of these matchups on UFC 300. And I think this is a perfect fight for UFC 300. I think it's a perfect fight for the prelims. I want to see how Aljo does at 145 pounds. Calvin Kattar is also coming off an injury in his fight against Arnold Allen, so I want to see how he looks now. And I think this is one of those fights that's actually pretty competitive. And I think you can make a solid argument for Calvin Kattar winning this fight. I think you can make a solid argument for Aljamain Sterling winning this fight. And I'm actually right now, I'm kind of leaning Aljamain Sterling to win the fight, but I'm very intrigued. Like I said, it's not a fight that's going to sell a lot of pay-per-views. I don't think any casuals are going to buy the pay-per-view because of Aljamain Sterling and Calvin Kattar. But if you're a hardcore fan and you've been watching for a long time, I think you're going to be pretty excited to see how Aljamain Sterling does in the featherweight division. Now, the next fight, Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. On paper, it's a dumb fight. It's a dumb fight because Justin Gaethje could probably already fought Islam Makhachev, and it's a dumb fight because Max Holloway, if he would have stayed in the featherweight division, he might have been able to fight Ilia Topuria next. So when you think about the fight, it's actually a fight that doesn't really make a lot of sense. However, I do think it's a very fun fight. I do think it's a very fun fight, and I think the more I've thought about the fight, I could see it being a little bit more competitive than we're expecting. I still think Justin Gaethje is going to be able to win, but I mean, Max Holloway is actually bulking up for the light. I was gonna say the featherweight division, for the lightweight division, so that should make the fight a little bit more interesting. But it's a fight that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And it's a very predictable fight for UFC 300. But I feel like once we're there, like once we're watching Gaethje versus Holloway about to start, I think we're gonna be very, very excited. So it's kind of been growing on me. I think we all want to know if Holloway's chin is going to be able to, you know, be durable in the lightweight division against somebody like Justin Gaethje. So we're all going to be watching, waiting to see if Max Holloway is going to get knocked out, if Max Holloway is able to beat Justin Gaethje. And if Max Holloway is able to knock out Justin Gaethje, I mean, it's going to be a big moment in the UFC. And if Justin Gaethje is able to knock out Max Holloway, I think it's also going to be a big moment. So even though this fight is kind of dumb on paper, I think there's going to be huge repercussions for both the lightweight division and the featherweight division. Because if Max Holloway gets knocked out, I mean, he's probably not going to be like a top contender at 145 pounds. Like, he might be different now, you know what I'm saying? And if he wins against Justin Gaethje, he might be next for the title. So you know what I'm saying? So even though this fight on paper is very dumb, I think there could be huge repercussions for both divisions. So for that reason, I think it's the third best fight on the card. Now, the second best fight on the card, in my opinion, is Jamal Hill versus Alex Pereira. I love this fight. This is a fight that I wanted to see in the light heavyweight division. I want to see Jamal Hill, how he does against Alex Pereira. Striking style, Jamal Hill is a very slick striker. Also pretty good kickboxing. Alex Pereira is one of the best kickboxers in the UFC. So a striker versus striker matchup at 205 with Alex Pereira. I mean, what more could you want from this matchup? I absolutely love this matchup. The only reason why this matchup, in my opinion, is not the best matchup at UFC 300 is because Jamal Hill, he is coming off an injury, and I still feel like he might be coming back too soon. I feel like the UFC kind of pressured Jamal Hill to take this fight because they probably didn't have any other main events, and because of that, like, I feel like the fight loses a bit of hype because, I want to see the best version of Jamal Hill fight Alex Pereira. I don't want to see a rush Jamal Hill try to fight Alex Pereira, because I think on paper Jamal Hill could win this fight and it should be very competitive, and I absolutely love this fight. But the fact that Jamal Hill might be rushing back in is what's kind of holding this fight back from being like this amazing fight, the number one fight at UFC 300, even though it is the main event. Now, you probably already realized that the best fight on this card is Charles Oliveira versus Armin Tsarukyan. This is arguably the best fight on UFC 300. I mean, excuse me, Charles Oliveira, one of our favorite lightweights, one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC currently. I mean, when has Charles Oliveira really been in a boring fight? Armin Saryukin, all the momentum in the world, coming off that knockout over Beneil Dariush. Very good, very well-rounded fighter, amazing grappling, fast hands. I think this fight is going to be incredible. And this is the fight on the card that keeps me up at night. Like, this is the fight where I'm like, man, I could see Armin Saryukin winning. I could see Charles Oliveira winning. I want to see how Charles Oliveira looks. And this fight also has huge, huge repercussions for the lightweight division because, I mean, if Charles Oliveira is able to beat Armin Saryukin, then that means that he might have improved enough to be competitive against Islam Makhachev. And if Armin Saryukin is able to make a statement and beat Charles Oliveira, he might be the next guy up. So I feel like when it comes to the matchups at UFC 300, Charles Oliveira versus Armin Saryukin is just the best fight in terms of skill. I absolutely love this fight. Yes, I'm a little bit biased because Charles Oliveira is one of my favorite fighters ever. But he's fighting a very worthy opponent, Armin Saryukin. Like, I don't think this is going to be a walk in the park. I think Armin Saryukin is as good as it gets. And I told you guys when Armin Saryukin was fighting Beneil Dariush, I told you Armin Saryukin is going to win this fight. And even though, you know, maybe he's not like the best striker, maybe he doesn't have like the best punching power, I told you he's just going to be too fast for Beneil Dariush and he's going to catch Beneil Dariush. Now the difference here is that I do feel like Charles Oliveira, better striker. He's going to be the bigger guy in the cage. But I could see Armin Saryukin having success with the grappling, but he's going to need to be careful with Charles Oliveira's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So when I think about this fight, I just feel like this fight is going to be a banger. Like, I cannot wait for Charles Oliveira versus Armin Saryukin. And in my opinion, it's easily the best fight on the card. I absolutely love this fight. This is my main event. My main event is Charles Oliveira versus Armin Saryukin. I absolutely cannot wait. This is the fight that I keep thinking about and going back and forth on. And when I think of UFC 300, this is the fight that gets me nervous. This is really the fight that gets me nervous. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please let me know down in the comments below your rankings for the UFC 300 fights. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.